Hey guys, sorry again I couldn't be with you today. Glad we have this medium that we can use to go ahead and finish up our notes. We only have one small section left, and we're going to talk about presidential reformers. So before I begin, just a reminder: we've talked about how the political and economic and social reforms have been taking place, and today we're going to look at some of the major proponents of those reforms, and they came from actually different political parties. But we see some of those progressive ideas come through in their policies as president. So we'll go ahead and get started. One of my favorite presidents was Teddy Roosevelt, 26th president of the United States. His nickname was the Trust Buster. And remember, we've talked about trusts and monopolies before. So he took on the name the Trust Buster. And we'll see actually that he did not bust as many trusts as some of the other presidents here, but he was very influential in trying to get those big companies broken up in order to try and get more of a better relationship between the consumer as well as the business. Teddy's initial platform was called the Square Deal. That was what he ran his campaign on. And very simply put, he promised fair treatment of average citizens and businessmen. Okay, so trying to keep a good balance, not going completely on the side of society. Also understanding that these companies, are the employers of the American society, and we need to make sure that what we do keeps them fairly happy as well. But frankly, there needs to be more regulation, and I think everybody probably agrees with that, given the problems that we've seen and read about in the jungle, and with unfair wages and working conditions, all of those things. So Teddy Roosevelt is the first reformer, and he's really trying to offer a square deal to both sides involved, the American public and American businesses. One of the first major pieces of legislation that Teddy Roosevelt offers is the Hepburn Act, and this was specifically designed to regulate the railroads. And if you remember back, this was one of those issues on the Omaha platform for the populists. They wanted the nationalization of the railroads. They don't exactly get that, but this act does help with a creation of a government commission in order to try and set how much the fees were being charged, to make sure, again, that we have kind of a fair deal for all involved. I didn't mention it, but Teddy Roosevelt takes over at kind of a strange time, and we'll talk about it more in depth later on. But he takes over after the assassination of William McKinley, and we'll kind of wait until next unit to get into that. But Teddy Roosevelt was one of the more powerful progressive reformers early on. Another thing that Teddy Roosevelt is well known for, and the reason that his face is a part of Mount Rushmore, is his role in the conservation movement. Already in the early 1900s, American society was realizing that our parks, our natural wildlife, was already rapidly diminishing, and we seem to think that it's a huge problem today, which it is. But 100 years ago, they identified it as a problem. Companies were coming in and logging, taking out all the timber, and all that was left, was barren land that was useless. So Teddy Roosevelt was very key in making sure that the National Park Service, got established during his presidency. As you can read there, 100 million acres fall under national control, protecting those parks. So we still have them today. So, we have national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone, and all of that is partly Teddy Roosevelt's doing as president. The next progressive president, and the man who took over after Teddy Roosevelt, was William Howard Taft. Right? Now, Taft was basically handpicked by Teddy Roosevelt to run after him. Roosevelt was kind of in a weird place because he had taken over after McKinley's assassination, had won the next election, but it was kind of a re-election since he had already been president, even though it was his first re-election that he went through, and then had won again in 1904. So he decided not to run for a third time, and we'll actually see that he breaks that promise later on. But in his place, he decided to kind of handpick a successor, and that was Taft. Taft was a very big man. You can see there, 6 foot, 350 pounds. Sadly, one of Taft's big legacies was the fact that he got stuck in the bathtub in the White House. Historians debate, whether the story actually had, if it was true or not. There is mention of this incident, and how embarrassing, right? I mean, having to have people in the White House help the president out of the bathtub. So pretty disgusting, but anyways, that is one of Taft's legacies, but we won't focus on that here. I mentioned that Teddy's nickname was the Trust Buster, and that was his nickname, but Taft was the true Trust Buster. In his 4 years in office, because he was not reelected, in his 4 years in office, he would bust up 90 trusts. Okay, Teddy, in his 7.5 years in office, almost 2 full terms, he busted up only 44 trusts. Okay, so as far as who the bigger progressive was here, Taft actually held more of those progressive reforms in the form of busting up the trusts. The last part of the top sentence angered progressive Republicans with tariff reform. Tariffs are becoming increasingly used to try and protect American business, and we've seen that before. Remember, a tariff is a tax on the import. So, we saw McKinley. The McKinley tariff was a huge tariff that was passed, and I just mention it because tariffs tend to slow down global trade, and we're going to see that becoming a major issue leading towards World War I, in which all the countries of the world really establish their own tariffs and the global economy slows down. So, kind of as a side note, Taft, messed with tariffs, angered a lot of Republicans, and that is another legacy, that he really angered those in his own party. And there's a reason he was only a one-term president. People on both sides really thought he did a poor job, even though he was the true trust buster. One major issue we've discussed the whole time is child labor. The stat I gave you yesterday, 2 million kids were, in the workforce in 1910. Well, in 1912, Taft is going to be responsible for creating the Children's Bureau, which is a government agency that investigated, the issues of child labor in this country and made sure that those issues were publicized and tried to get legislation in order to stop child labor being used in the factories. So after Taft's election in 1908, he serves out that full term, and really he kind of is seen as a betrayer of these progressive attitudes, even though he does bust up the trust. And so he upsets, of course, the Democrats don't like him, and the Republicans don't like him anymore. And the man he probably upset the most was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt handpicked Taft for this position. And so what ends up happening in the election of 1912 is actually a three-way election. You have the Democrats, the Republicans, but Teddy Roosevelt kind of comes out of retirement here, and he is going to run as a third-party candidate. Okay, now, that third party, he calls it the Bull Moose Party. All right? And we haven't really discussed Teddy Roosevelt's character, but he was an adventurer, an explorer. He would go off on safari in Africa, and he was kind of seen as this big, strong, burly guy. And we'll talk more about that with the Spanish-American War next unit. But he forms the Bull Moose Party, and he focuses on more progressive Republicans. And so he splits the Republican ticket. And that's often what you see with third-party candidates, is that whichever side they are closest to, it splits the votes of that party. And so the election of 1912 is won by the Democratic nominee. And if memory serves me correctly, I don't think he even received the majority of the popular vote. So if Taft decided not to run again, or if Roosevelt decided to stay out, most likely one of the other two men would have been picked in 1912. We most likely have a more conservative president in 1912, but instead, Woodrow Wilson gets the win. Now, Wilson is the 28th president of the United States, and he is a Democrat. Okay, we have had a long string of Republicans up until this time, and Woodrow Wilson represents kind of some new Democratic ideals coming out, and by this point, the Democrats have adopted some of these progressive reforms here. Remember, we discussed McKinley, how McKinley had won as a Republican back in 1896, and how he had defeated William Jennings Bryan, who had these populist ideas. Well, as a Democratic nominee, Wilson is going to adopt some of those, and the first, his big platform that he runs on is called the New Freedom Plan. He is also going to attack trusts, monopolies, and he is also going to focus on tariffs and potentially creating a wedge kind of between business and society. One of his biggest failures, and historians really debate on kind of the racist qualities behind Woodrow Wilson. I hate to say that, but really there was a big question because he truly failed to issue any kind of legislation that dealt with civil rights. We've discussed the rise of the KKK during this time, and that's important to note. Not saying he was a member, but you have a strong push against civil rights, what Washington and Du Bois are pushing for, and Wilson did nothing to continue the push for civil rights. We won't see that emerge again and really until the 1950s, primarily due to the two world wars. But under Wilson, we have two major pieces of legislation here. The first is the Clayton Antitrust Act. We've discussed the Sherman Antitrust Act before, but what this act said was that corporations couldn't own stock in other corporations. Okay? There was a lot of insider trading going on here, and companies were feeding each other information, and so you had kind of this good old boys club where they were getting rich because of the information they were sharing, and it wasn't fair to the public. It wasn't fair to the normal investor. Under Wilson, the government will also establish the Federal Trade Commission, which is still important today. It is still in place to make sure that those who are buying and selling commodities and stocks and bonds, all those things, that there's no insider trading going on, trying to avoid that unfair business tactics. The sad example I'll give you, some of you may have seen Martha Stewart on television. She's the one always weaving baskets or something, I don't know, doing floral arrangements. But Martha Stewart actually was caught doing some insider trading a few years ago, and she went to prison for a few years because of that. Well, it was the FTC that was responsible for putting her in prison, for prosecuting her. But again, insider trading, it's something that really punishes the vast majority of society and allows kind of those the bigwigs to share information and get rich off each other. Unfair. Wilson tried to get rid of that. The third big piece of legislation that Wilson was responsible for, my least favorite amendment, is the 16th. Okay, the federal income tax. Now, if you remember back to the populist lecture that we had, this was one of their big issues they wanted passed. Okay, try to get a graduated income tax. Wilson fulfills that here. He's going to try to get rid of the tariffs as our national income and instead replace it with income tax. So instead of taxing imports, we're going to tax citizens. I will note, remember, for your test, you will need to know basically everything from the Civil War amendments up through the 21st Amendment with the repeal of Prohibition. This is one of those. Okay, so the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax. Make sure you are aware of that. And the fourth and final is the Federal Reserve. Okay. Wilson agrees to allow private banks, and don't let the term federal fool you. This is not a government entity per se. They are very closely tied to the government. But the Federal Reserve is the collection of banks that can issue paper money, and they basically have this relationship with the government where they control interest rates, they control how much money is being printed, which is very important, right? We talked about how you can't just flood the markets, you can't just flood society with more money in order to try and solve problems. That leads to inflation. So the Federal Reserve is still important today. What they say goes. If they say that rates are going up, I mean, it has a huge effect on the stock market and how banks operate. So another issue that was created 100 years ago that is still drastically affecting us now. So that brings us to the end of our lecture. This finishes up the notes, and I hope you guys, if you have any questions, you email me. Okay, feel free to tweet at Mr. T History. The notes and review guide will be available on MrTHistory.com. So enjoy reading through those, reviewing for our upcoming test, and let me know if you have any questions.